Okay, let's open the doors to our guests today. It's another big event for Bentham Science. And as always, I'm joined by my friend and colleague. Oh, I think you're on this side. Not sure which side to point on Zoom. Professor Gareth Dyke. How are you today, Gareth?
I'm doing great. Not too bad. Thanks very much, Scott. How are you? Everything okay?
Doing fantastically well. It's sweater season here in the Northern Hemisphere. For some of those of you in the global South are enjoying the warmer months coming, but here it's getting a bit chilly. Yeah. How's the weather there today?
Oh my, it's not great. It's foggy and cold, and it's been snowing earlier this morning. So we're not doing
Oh,
so well, unfortunately. But yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. It's great to see everybody, and do let us know in the chat where you're from. Do let us know like where you're joining us today from. That would be great to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us.
great. We've opened up the chat. So, as Gareth said, let us know where you're joining us from, where in the world you are. We always love to know where our guests are joining us from. And just type a few words, say hello, let us know who you are and what you're working on. And hopefully, you're here because you'd like to learn more from Professor Dyke about choosing the best journal for your next publication, and also some tips and tricks on submission to your chosen journal. And who better to ask than Gareth, someone who has published more than 300 papers as an author, and he himself is a journal editor, so he's seen it from both sides. And I always glean lots of interesting insights from Gareth. Gareth, are there any key points that you would like our guests to keep in mind as they join your talk today?
We're gonna see what happens. We're gonna see like what we can impart in our session today together, Scott, like about journal selection and learning about submission. And I think we'll come back to some tips and tricks like how to pick the right journal, how to select a good journal for your research. In the event, we're seeing lots of activity in the chat box: Mexico, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Romania. Wow, this is fantastic. Malaysia, Poland. Um, I think Wales. I don't know. Let's see. Fantastic. Great to see everybody, really.
Great to see everyone, and kudos to the gentleman from Mexico City. It must be very early for you. Thanks for joining so early in the day. And for everyone else joining, fantastic to have you here. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day or night and your busy research cycle to come and join this talk today. Thank you very much, everyone.
Absolutely. And everybody joining will get a certificate, of course, access to the recording. So even if it's early in the morning and you're still half asleep, don't worry. You'll be able to get access to the recording. You can listen back again and again and again in the future. Fantastic to see so many people.
Great. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We do have another bonus to share with you as well. After the event, of course, we will share a certificate with all of our guests today, just to show our appreciation for you joining. We know that for many of you, this is a key part of your CV. And also, we'll be sharing with you our template for pre-submission inquiries, which is one of Professor Dyke's tips and tricks for submission success. We'll share that template with you as well. So yes, you'll get access to a full video recording. We do not share the original PowerPoint slides, but we will share, even better than that, the full video recording of today's talk, including an AI summary, the chat notes. You'll get a template for pre-submission inquiries, excuse me, and a certificate of attendance. So look forward to that in your inbox tomorrow, 24 hours after the event is finished. So thanks again to everyone for joining us today.
Awesome. Yeah. And we do these events, Scott and I, we do them all the time. And today we're delighted to be presenting on behalf of Bentham Science Publishers. So if you haven't heard about Bentham before, what do people need to know about Bentham, Scott? It's a great publisher, right?
It's a growth publisher, and with a particular focus on science, tech, and medical research. As you can see on the slide here, more than 160 print and online journals. You've got books, ebooks, hybrid and open access journals, green and gold open access, more than 1,300 online books. And yeah, a really high quality publisher with impact factor journals, and very well indexed, and a member of COAT, the Committee on Publication Ethics.
I see people are raising their hands. What we're going to do is we're going to have some interaction as we go through this event today, some quizzes, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the very end of our event today. So do hold those questions. We'll be back at the end to answer any of your questions. Bentham, if you haven't heard of Bentham, do have a look at Bentham's website. And if you're a librarian, right, Scott, librarians can scan this QR code and get access to all of Bentham's content for 3 months.
Absolutely. It's a completely free trial. 3 months, there's no obligation at all, nothing to lose from just signing up for a trial for your institution library.
Or if you know the librarian at your institution, take a screenshot, send it to them, tell them to scan the QR code, because what they'll get is 3 months free access to all of the Bentham journals, the complete collection. So that's 40 plus impact factor journals. And you can see then if it's useful. You can see then if you like it. You can see then if it's going to be something that your researchers are going to want to dip into in the future. So without further ado, I think we're almost ready to get started, right, Scott?
Yeah, I think our guests are filing in. So yeah, I think we can kick off. And again, as Gareth mentioned, Professor Dyke will be taking your questions at the end. We love questions. We'd love to hear from you. Love to hear your comments and experiences as well. Let's keep the chat as lively as we can. And remember, there is a Q&A box where you can ask your questions. You can just click at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little box with a question mark in there. That's the Q&A. So if you've got questions for Gareth, we'll be happy to answer those at the end of the talk today. So feel free to ask away. And feel free to share your experiences in the chat, questions in the QA. And with that, over to you, Professor.
Wow, thanks so much. We're going to take away the QR code. Don't worry, we'll be able to put that back up at the end of the event again. So if you've missed it, not to worry. But for now, let's just get started with our event today. And you'll all be familiar with this kind of graphic. You'll all have seen this kind of graphic many times in the past. Intuitively, the research cycle, the academic publishing cycle, goes from ideas, funding, data collection, journal selection, article writing, submission, and peer review and publication. Around and around the wheel of fortune we go with each of our academic projects. And you're probably thinking, hey, I've got a funding application pending at the moment, or I'm currently thinking about a journal to pick for my next research project. Perhaps you're writing a paper or struggling to deal with peer review and the peer review process. We are here to help. Scott and I are always available to help you with any questions or any issues that you might have around the academic publishing cycle. But for now, in this Bentham Science webinar, we're going to talk about journal selection. In the middle of the wheel, after data collection, after funding, we'll talk about why that is in a moment. But journal selection, picking a good journal for your next research paper, is one of, if not the most important steps in the process. It fits in very clearly in the process, and we're going to argue in this event that it often should happen before article writing, and that's very important as a starting point for this presentation today. Having a journal in mind before you begin the writing process is really, really important. So we'll begin. We'll talk a little bit about this. We'll give you some hints and tips and tricks and suggestions for selecting, for targeting, for discovering a great journal for your next research paper. And of course, this is all about finding the best possible target journal. And why it's so important is because targeting journals effectively with your research ideas, often before you write the paper, can help and speed up the eventual publication of the article. You can also maximize your impact. Very clearly, making a good journal selection will maximize the impact that your research has. And of course, as well, very important in this day and age, to be aware of and able to detect and avoid fake or predatory journals in the process, because you've done the research. You don't want to then end up, unfortunately, submitting the work to a journal that's not the best possible choice, or even a journal that might not be a real journal at the end of the day. So journal selection, very, very important. And of course, it's our topic for today's Bentham Science presentation. It's your all-important first step. You want to make sure that your research, your paper, stands out from all of the other published work that's out there in the world. We see about 2 million research articles published every year in academic publishing, and about 30,000 in medical and health sciences alone are published every month, which is an incredible amount of content, an amazing amount of research being published. The key is to make sure that your work is visible, that your work stands out, that people are going to read your paper, and that partly comes from an effective venue, an effective target journal choice with your work. So again, the topic for today's session, helping you to target an effective journal choice for your work so that you can maximize your impact, which is something that Scott and I also talk about a lot in these events, in our training, how you can understand the impact of your research. And most researchers, let's face it, they don't really think all that much in terms of impact beyond the academic impact of their work, the impact factor, how many people are citing the paper, how many times it's getting downloaded and used. Academic impact, we care about that because our research institutions want us, of course, to publish in the biggest, highest impact factor journals that we can. But let's also encourage you, as you listen to this, and hopefully other Bentham Science Sidetrain presentations in the future, about your economic and societal impact as well, which of course is just as important for researchers these days as where you publish the work. And we'll come back to that in a bit in the context of journal selection, because you want the work that you do, you want the research that you do to make a difference to the lives of ordinary people. You want your research to have an economic and societal benefit and impact, as well as just an academic impact. So we'll think about that as well in the context of which journals we should be picking for our research work. And let's just jump on to the next slide as we begin to think about this. And I know Scott's going to come back now as we think about this particular process. When should we be picking a journal for our research? Scott?
Okay, thank you, Gareth. Let's take a poll and just see when our guests would typically select a journal. So in other words, when would you select the journal for your next publication? So I'm going to launch a poll here for our guests. As you can see, there are three choices. Do you typically select a journal before you start writing? Now, be honest. Do you typically select a journal while you are writing your manuscript? In other words, after you've started writing part of it, maybe you've outlined it or written some sections, would you select a journal then? Or C, would you typically select your journal after you finish writing your manuscript? Be honest, it's anonymous, there's no shame. Let us know what you would normally do and when you would normally select a journal for your paper. Answers coming in hot.
Yeah, we usually get quite a spread of answers for this particular poll, don't we, Scott? It's quite an interesting one.
We do. And I think some of our guests have been to our events before, so they can anticipate the correct question. But I'm also interested to see, honestly, what people would do. So feel free to answer honestly. There's no shame, and it's totally anonymous.
Yeah, I mean, I must say I've done all of these over the course of my academic career, as I'm sure many of our participants will agree. I mean, it's a difficult one, but there is a way to be more effective as a writing and publishing academic.
Okay, looks like the answers are mostly in. We'll end the poll here and let's see what we got. So 43% of our guests today said they'll select a journal before they start writing. 24% said they'll start selecting a journal after or while they're writing their manuscript, excuse me. And 33% said they will select a journal after they finish writing. Professor, is there an ideal time to select a journal for your paper?
I would say yes. And I would say that based on experience and based on talking to lots of researchers, journal editors, and academics around the world. If you can, try to have a journal in mind or a journal set in mind before you begin the writing process. And we'll talk about why that is a little bit later on in our event today. But it really does help with the process. If you have a target journal in mind before you begin the writing process, That helps a lot with lots of the common kinds of questions that researchers often ask us. Right, Scott?
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, Gareth, we'll share some tips on why this is the best time to select a journal for your paper. Although it seems not very intuitive, you would think you want to write your paper first so you know what you actually have to shop around. But as we're going to see in a few minutes, as Gareth will explain, it's actually better to choose a journal before you actually start writing or start writing significant amounts of your paper.
It certainly is. And part of the reason for this, as we're going to see as we move on with our presentation today, is that, of course, every journal is quite different. Every publisher has different instructions for authors. Each article looks quite different. Every journal has a different scope, a different audience, and the articles that you might be writing for different journals could be different in length in terms of the content that you'd need to include. So think about your journal, but also think about what kind of article you're going to be writing when you put your paper together. When you've collected your research data, you're addressing a question, let's say, or testing a hypothesis, you've got the data, you're now thinking, I know what the key takeaways are from this particular piece of research. I know what's most important. I know what the key message is here. I'm now going to target that at a particular journal. And that's one of the best pieces of advice I was given when I was a PhD student. What kind of paper do you want to write? You can answer that for yourself based upon the research that you're doing. Now go and find some other papers recently published in leading journals that do something similar to the article that you want to write and target those journals. You can even look at the shape and look at the structure of the papers that you found in order to help you to do that. So targeting journals before you begin the writing process is one tip from successful researchers, from successful, highly published academics that we can copy. You'll know the journal's aims and scope. You'll know their readership, the disciplines, the topics, the types of articles that they publish. You'll also know their guidelines, the general procedures, the kind of peer review that they use, what sort of formatting, the word limits, copyrights, and even things like which kind of English to use. And I would say if you've got a journal in mind, you'll answer for yourself many of the key questions that researchers have. How much information goes into the different sections? What should the figure captions look like? What should the title look like? All of these things are answered if you have a target journal in mind at the beginning of the writing process. And we always like to say in these training events, before you begin to write, you need to have in mind 3 things. You need to have thought about 3 elements to be successful at putting an article together, writing and publishing a successful academic paper. Your message. What is the key takeaway that you want people reading your paper to get out of that experience? What's the message? Who are the audience? And of course, that's the target journal, the audience, the readership of the work, and the structure. Your message, your audience, and your structure are key elements to have in mind before you begin the writing process. So if you forget everything else that we talk about in this training event today, do have a think when you sit down and begin the process of putting your next paper together. What's the take-home message? What do you want people to gain from reading this particular article? Who's the audience going to be? What target journal are you going to choose? And from that, of course, comes the structure of the writing. Message, audience, and structure, part of the key to success as an academic, and reasons why we recommend that you do choose a journal early. Now, what kinds of elements are important for researchers when they pick a journal, when they select a journal to target with their next piece of research? Well, impact factor, obviously. Reputation as well. Within a particular field, different journals with different groups of researchers have different reputations. What will the reach of your publication in this particular journal be within and beyond your own research field? And will the work be open access? Will it be accessible? Will the work, when published, be open access. And these are different criteria, different things that researchers keep in mind when picking a journal. It really is a marriage, as we like to say, between your research and its effective publication as you pick a journal for your next piece of research. And the researchers that we talk to, the academics that we talk to all the time, are thinking about speed of publication. They're thinking about how what the readership will be of the article that they're going to publish, how many people are going to get to read it, what kind of readership will they experience with the work, and of course, what's the impact factor of the journal. So time to publish, reach and readership, and the impact factor, elements that come together in your mind as a researcher when you start to select a target journal for your research. So we'll keep these elements in mind, of course, when we think about which journal to target with our next research paper. And breaking it down in more details here, you can have a think about which factor is most important to you: aims and scope and readership, the article type, the length, the evidence level that you'll be required to put into the work, what's the publication speed, the frequency, the indexing, the rank, the impact factor. Will it be print, online? Will it be open access? And what's the acceptance rate, likely acceptance rate? And you can look at the journal websites of journals that you target. At Bentham Science, for example, we have all of this information available easily on the websites of individual journals. So you can see the aims and scope. You can see what kinds of articles the journals are publishing. What's the publication speed, the frequency, indexing, rank, and impact factor? Will it be open access? Well, as we'll talk about in a moment, many journals are not open access, but if a fee is paid, you can convert that paper to fully open access. And of course, as well, the acceptance rate. Which factor is most important to you? And breaking it down even further, we just put this table together to give you some information about the indicators that international journals use to advertise themselves and to give you data about, themselves and what they do and what they publish. And we won't read this out, but you'll have access to this next time you're looking at a journal, next time you're evaluating a target journal. You can see when you read about the site score, what does that mean? When you read about the H index value, what does that mean? When you look at the impact factor, what does that mean? This table breaks it all down for you in simple and easy to understand terms. So when picking a journal, message, audience, and structure, we are going to be aiming high, going for journals with better impact factors, with better reputations, with higher reach within the field. We'll aim high. We'll try to get our work published in the best possible journals. But of course, that's not always possible. We will experience rejection. And that's why with your research, and this comes with experience, this comes with time, you get better at picking an appropriate venue for that particular piece of research as you learn to choose your journals appropriately. And then we're here, Scott and I at Bentham Science, to help you learn and manage and sell your submissions to journals and become better at managing the process, right, Scott? It's a learning curve, all of this.
It is. And I think a lot of authors ask us about your third rule. So I'm going to pause here for a moment, if you don't mind, Gareth, and just ask you to elaborate, because we do sometimes get questions about this. When we say to sell, first of all, there are two key words, I think, in your rule number 3 there that we sometimes get asked about. One is the word sell. When we say sell, what we mean is to promote your submission to a potential publisher. Can you explain just a little bit about what it means to sell or promote a publication at submission?
Well, you've got your message. You know what the key takeaway is going to be from the research. You've discovered something, or you've got some new results, or you have a piece of information that you really want to write about, the key message of your study. The point now is to talk to the editor, talk to the journal team, talk to the editorial office when you make that initial, and we'll talk about this in a moment, you make that pre-submission inquiry or you send in a cover letter with your submission to the journal, you are going to be convincing the editor, the editorial team, that they should be publishing this work. They should be sending this work out for peer review. It's a good fit for the journal. It's a very significant advance. You have to sell that discovery, that message, initially to the editor, and then again in the text of the paper as you write it up. I hope does that explain it a little bit better? Does that make sense?
I think it does. And I think a lot of authors ask us about this. And when we say sell, it's just as you explained, you are promoting your research initially to the journal to get it published. And then, of course, you want to promote to other researchers so that they will read and cite your work. Fantastic. Thank you, Professor. And the other word here, I think that's key in your rule number 3 is managing your submission. And I think the key to this is communication. Am I right on that, Professor?
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. We have other events as well. If you'd like to join us for other Bentham Science webinars where we talk about different aspects of the publication process. But don't just sit back after you've made your submission and do nothing for months and months and months. Managing your submission means that you continue to communicate with the editor, with the journal team, asking for updates when necessary, and then dealing effectively, efficiently with the peer review comments when they come back from the journal after a reasonable amount of time. So managing the submission is talking about things that you can do as a researcher to ensure that your paper has the best possible chance of acceptance. And there's a bit of a gap there, really, in terms of where you can go online to find out information about suitable journals. And so our personal recommendation, completely agnostic of publishers, completely independent of Bentham Science or any other publisher, the EdAnts Journal Selector tool, you can find it easily by Googling, or I'm sure Scott will put the link in the chat. It's a tool that you can use to find journal recommendations, journal suggestions that are publisher independent. And so we recommend that to people as a great way to get started finding a journal for your next paper. Which brings us on to some of the different kinds of journals that are out there in the wider world. And the first thing to talk about, probably a big question that many people have, is about open access. Open access publishing is huge, of course, these days. This means that when you publish something, your research outputs are freely accessible to everyone. And this can include article, data, results, and sometimes even peer review. It's one of the 2 main kinds now of research publishing, the other being subscription-based traditional journals. We'll talk about those in a moment. In open access journal publishing, you own the copyright. Your research is covered by copyright, but reuse is allowed with attribution. And of course, the work is also permanently archived in a recognized repository. Open access publishing is a movement, part of the open science movement, and it's very, very important to lots of researchers that what they publish is freely accessible to anybody, anywhere in the world. So open access, an open access journal, might be a journal that you pick for your next piece of research. Maybe having the work that you publish open and accessible to everybody is really important to you. I know it's really important to me. If you do this, if you choose an open access journal, you will get increased readership and citations. Your Altmetric scores, your citation and download, article use scores will go up. You'll have greater impact and visibility. This is also important for complying with funder mandates in many cases, but you get more collaborators. You meet more people around the world. Your work will simply be more accessible to more people. So open access publishing, it levels the playing field internationally for researchers. And so this is important as a model that people like to follow. And of course, at Bentham, we have a division called Bentham Open, which is our gold open access journal division, where you've got immediate access to all of the content for a fee. Unfortunately, the open access business model is dependent on somebody paying for that open access publication, usually either the author or the funding agency. So OA models, and you can see the three main ones here on the slide, they balance cost, accessibility, and control. And Bentham, of course, uses all three of these in different journals. And we'll talk about what they mean in a moment. Gold, green, and diamond. Different open access publishing models, different ways that you can have your work published, fully open and fully accessible to all. But, of course, unfortunately, because there's often a fee, an article processing charge involved in open access publishing, many fake predatory journals have sprung up around the world, different publishers, different websites, offering to publish your work in a journal, open access, but they're not really who they say they are. These are known as predatory journals. They try to get your money and then they publish your work, but they don't often peer review it, and they don't often publish it in a journal that really has the reach and reputation that you need as a researcher. And of course, it's difficult to spot these predators. We all get millions of emails all of the time. We're going to talk a little bit about how you can spot potentially a fake or predatory journal. It could be the website. The URL is strange. The indexing is not there. Journals should be in good indexing sites like the Directory of Open Access Journals. Who's on the editorial board? Membership is unknown. Maybe these people don't actually work for the journal. Of course, you can write to editors, you can find out more. Are they publishing regularly? Are the articles being properly peer reviewed? Do they match with the aims and scope? What kind of fee structure is the journal using? Never, ever pay anything for publication before your article has been peer reviewed. And finally, accepted. And of course, another key marker of predatory spamming journals is that you get lots and lots of emails full of empty promises. A real journal, such as the Bentham journals, are members of COPE. They're listed in databases like OASPA. The journals have robust peer review. All Bentham journals use a double-blind peer review process, with the control over that process completely independent from the editorial board, from the editors. And there are fees, but those fees and policies are fair. They're clearly listed and they're explained in detail. So do have a look at some of the websites we've put here on this slide. Think, Check, Submit, the COPE website, publicationethics.org, and others, when you start to think about which journal to use for your next paper. And of course, very important to get ahead of the curve, to get your work selected for publication in an excellent journal. It's a great idea to think about using a preprint platform. These are places online, you can see some of them listed here, Research Square, BioArchive, PeerJ, and so on, where you can put a draft of your work online and it can be shared openly with the public, with other researchers, before it gets peer reviewed and published. And this is a great way to get your work out there, and also to get journal editors potentially interested in your paper for their journal. We'll talk more about preprint platforms, I'm sure, in our Q&A, but a great choice as part of the open science, open access movement to get your work shared with the world. Let's look now at journal submission. Having talked a little bit about journals and the different kinds of journals that we see out there in the world today, let's quickly have a look at the submission process itself. Journal submission. Very, very important, because there's lots of confusion internationally about this as a process. In particular, starting with our use of the English word editor. Very many different kinds of editors out there that you might encounter. We use that word in English for lots of different people that you encounter during the publishing process. The managing editor, the academic editor, people like me who are handling peer review, selecting peer reviewers for papers. Language editors who are working on the language itself, as well as you, the author, and knowing who you're talking to, effectively communicating with different people at different stages of the process is very, very important. So if you have questions about who you're talking to at a journal and how to communicate with them, do get in touch with us, because Scott and I will be delighted to give you a bit of support, help you with that process, with that submission and communication process. Because as we talked about before, selling your paper to editors, making that initial submission to journals involves selling your work to the journal initially, because desk editors at the initial submission stage, they think, does this work fit with the journal scope? Does the article have a clear message? Is it original? Is it important? Is it true? And will this work be relevant to the readers of our journal? These are key features, key questions to ask yourself when putting your work together and when thinking about which journal to target, and indeed when writing a cover letter to send with your submission to a journal, because you don't want to get the paper desk rejected. You don't want the editor to come back and say, we're just not interested, we're not going to send this out for peer review. You want to get through that initial editorial triage stage. And so when thinking about submission, think about these quick questions, this quick checklist for novelty in the submission process. How novel is my paper? How good are my methods? The number one question that reviewers always have with academic papers is to do with the methods. Have I minimized bias? What are the real-world implications of this study, and for how long? Is my study ethically compliant? And is my writing highly readable, suitable for non-specialist readers? And if you want some tips and tricks on English writing, we do have a number of other events, a number of other webinars that we can point you to in the follow-up from this one about effective English and effective communication skills. But let's quickly talk now about pre-submission inquiries, because these are really important as a mechanism that you can employ to get your work ahead of the curve, to get your work successfully submitted into those journals, right, Scott?
Absolutely. And this is a tool that you introduced me to some years back, Gareth, and I think it's a fantastic way to reach out to editors and publishers and just, see if they might be interested in your research. So let's launch a poll and see how much our guests know about pre-submission inquiries. So the question is, how many pre-submission inquiries can you send to journals at a time? A, only one at a time, B, up to 3, or C, unlimited pre-submission inquiries?
This is a great approach to get your work out there in front of journal editors. So we do recommend you have a think about doing this, by the way.
Okay, answers still coming in from our attendees today. Okay, see some answers changing as well. People are rethinking their decisions. It's great to see. Okay, we're gonna end the poll here and see where we finished up. Okay, let me share the results here, and looks like 55% of our guests today, you can only send one pre-submission inquiry at a time, 14% up to 3, and 32% of our guests believe that you can send unlimited pre-submission inquiries to journals. Gareth, what's the correct answer here?
Really interesting that we got those responses from people, because of course you can send as many as you like, as many pre-submission inquiries as you like can go into journals before submission. You can only make the submission once, of course, but pre-submission inquiries, you have an unlimited number that you can send in to journals, which is really worth knowing and a technique that you can apply in your own writing and publishing. Really, really an important trick. We're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail in the time that we have left today. Very, very key trick, right, Scott, that people can employ for getting their papers successfully into journals.
Right. And speaking as you are as a journal editor, this is something that editors actually appreciate. I think a lot of our guests are a little bit shy about sending these out, about sort of sending a pre-advertisement for their paper, but actually editors appreciate this, don't they?
Absolutely. You can write to as many as you like. There's no limit to the number of editors that you can write to. If you have your abstract and your title ready to go, or a draft of those, do send those off because editors appreciate this. It saves them time. It keeps their workload down. They can often say, well, this is not suitable for this journal. Please try another journal. And indeed, we've got an email template that we'll be sharing with everybody at the end of this event today. So, stand by for that, because we're here to help. We're going to give you that email template. You can use it in order to get your paper successfully into a journal. And of course, when an editor comes back and says, I'd love to see a submission, your next stage is, of course, to write a cover letter when you make your submission to the journal. And we see lots of cover letters that look like this. Nothing. People put no effort and energy at all into selling their work to the editor and explaining why the paper should be sent out for peer review. This is not what we want. It's a real wasted opportunity, as is this kind of cover letter, which is really boring, really dry. Dear editor, please find our paper enclosed, blah, blah, blah. What you want to do with a cover letter, and again, we'll give you a template for this at the end of our event today, is give the editor some useful information. Please find our paper enclosed. We believe readers would benefit. Past studies, the following people suggested as peer reviewers. Don't waste the opportunity to sell your work to your target journal. When you put your cover letter together, it's got to give the editor a good deal of information about why the paper is important. Why is the topic important? Why are the results significant? The key result. Why is this an advance on previous work? Why this journal? Why this journal? And also, don't forget to put into your cover letter some peer reviewer suggestions. The editor may not use them, but you nevertheless have them there in any case. And if you're writing, if you're communicating with journals, be polite and be constructive. Don't do this kind of thing and try to add extra authors to the paper at the end of the process after the paper's been accepted. I've made some modifications. I've added 2 authors. That is a big, big, big red flag to journal editors. Don't do it. Don't try to add authors to a paper after your paper's been accepted. This is a breach of several ethical guidelines. Sending a paper to a journal at the submission stage requires that all authors know about and support the submission. So trying to add authors after acceptance immediately causes alarm at the editorial office. And this will require lots of extra paperwork, lots of extra steps at the editorial office stage. Similarly, be aware of these kinds of authorships: ghost and gift authorships. Ghost authors are situations where somebody does lots of work writing a paper, but then isn't included as an author. And this is unfortunately quite common in medical disciplines, pharmaceutical disciplines, where a writer can get paid to put the paper together, but is then not included as an author. Those are what we call ghost authorships. On the other hand, gift authorships, these are very common as well. Be aware of these too, where somebody who didn't really contribute to an article is nevertheless included on the paper, like your boss, the director of the research group. Is it ethical? We encourage you to think about these 2 issues as well. And lastly, if you do get rejected, don't worry, this is common. Rejection, unfortunately, is a fact of life in academic publishing. Only people who work in sales end up getting rejected more often, unfortunately. But if you feel that you've been rejected by a journal for reasons that you can address, perhaps you feel you've been treated unfairly, then don't forget to write an appeal, the last stage of the communication process. If you are confident, if you believe in your work, it is always possible to write an appeal letter and ask the editor for a second chance. If you've got information that you can give to the journal that contradicts, that shows why the peer reviewers are not doing the best job, you should always write an appeal, right, Scott? What's the worst that can happen?
Absolutely. There's nothing wrong with communicating. And as you always say, don't wait, communicate. This is the key to as you said earlier, managing your submission is to be open and communicate respectfully, but also, express your and sell yourself to the journal the best that you can. And I think that last topic is a very hot topic because we have several questions from our audience today about rejection. So shall we jump into some Q&A before we finish today, Professor?
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. I hope we have time left for some Q&A. That would be fantastic. Thank you so much,
Yes.
everybody.
Yeah, we have some great questions coming in. Thanks, everyone. We'll go through these as many as we can. If we cannot get to your question today, we'll reach out to you and see if we can provide some answers for you privately. But in the meantime, let's go to some of the most commonly asked questions today. One of our guests asks, what are effective strategies if an article is repeatedly rejected by journals with high relevance? I guess that means by relevance, you mean you match their aims and scope and so on. So again, the question is, if an article is repeatedly rejected by journals, are there steps to improve fit without overhauling the research? This is a fantastic question. Professor, any thoughts on this?
I would be concerned if a piece of research gets continually rejected by a range of journals in the subject area. I would actually encourage you in that situation to go back and have a think about why it's being repeatedly rejected. I mean, you may not need to do too much, but I would want to see like the rejection letters. I'd want to see the peer reviews from those journals and find out what it is that a repeated series of journals, a repeated series of peer reviewers are finding so problematic about the work. And maybe, unfortunately, maybe you will need to go back and start again with this particular study or make some important modifications. Perhaps there's a piece of the methods that you are doing in a certain way that the journals aren't liking. I mean, to answer that question, Scott and I would need to see the review comments. But I think, yeah, if you're getting repeatedly rejected, then I think maybe it's time for a bit of a rethink about why the paper's getting repeatedly rejected. I see Xavier is asking about the EdAnts journal selector. Yes, if you can find it, Xavier, it's still there. It's still operational. You're quite right. The edants.com site has been migrated over to Scribendi, but the tool is still available. Scott?
Yeah, I've just put the link to the journal selector in the chat box. It's still operational. As Gareth mentioned, Edons and Scribendi have married, and a lot of the services are being now conducted on the Scribendi site, but the journal selector is still there, still seems to be working. In fact, I just used it last week to search for some journals. So yeah, seems to be up and running. Thanks for your questions, everyone. There's a few more here that I think are relevant to communication in particular. Gareth, here's a question from our guest who asks, let me just find that question again. This guest says, thank you for the insightful discussion. Please, I would like to know what an author should do if after writing to a journal editor about a submitted revised manuscript, but do not get a response, what do you advise should be done in such a situation? So our guest revised and resubmitted and has not heard back now from the journal editor.
I mean, hopefully you can check the submission site and make sure that your paper has been progressed. Like many of the submission sites that journals use have that functionality where you can see the stage that your paper is at. So my first stop would be to go and check that and see where the submission site is telling me that the paper is. Is it with the editor or has it been sent out for peer review again? Because often when papers go back to journals after peer review the first time, they may be sent out for peer review a second time, depending on the editor, depending on the level of comments. So you may find that that's what's happened. But if you've written to the editor and he or she hasn't replied, and it's been a few weeks, I would strongly encourage you to write again. Maybe, you know, try with a different email address or with your institutional email address so that you don't get caught in any spam filters. But do write again. And then, of course, you need to politely escalate the situation if you haven't heard back after another reasonable period of time. I mean, I would then start to think about who else I could write to within the journal, within the publishing company. But you shouldn't wait. As Scott said before, we encourage everybody not to wait, but to communicate, to make sure that you aren't in the position where you're sitting there waiting for news endlessly. You must politely communicate with the journal editor if you can.
Definitely. Great question. And thank you, as always, Professor, for sharing your insights. Another great question, going back earlier in the process here to journal selection. So one of our guests here asks, for collaborative work, how can multiple authors agree on a target journal if they have different publication goals or priorities? Oh, what a fantastic question. How
That's a
can
great.
multiple authors agree on a target journal, different publication goals
Oh,
or priorities? Great
well,
question.
that's a fantastic question, and thank you for asking that. Generally, we would advise you very, very strongly that before you start writing the paper, and this is another reason why it's important to pick a target journal at the beginning of the process. I mean, we would advise like some kind of meeting or get together amongst the authors, and a joint decision should be made on both authorship order and the target journal at that stage, or at least like which journal or journals you're going to try first of all. I mean, conflicts will happen and disagreements will happen, but there should be somebody within the team who's leading the project. And usually that would be the first or the last author, the lab group head, the person who's done the research. There should be somebody who's obviously going to be the first author on this paper. And of course, we can talk about this more offline if you get in touch with us. But that person who's leading the project has to have the final say. There'll be disagreements, but please try to agree this in a friendly way, of course. But we're going to try nature first, and then if we get rejected, we're going to try science, and if we get rejected, we're going to try proceedings of the Royal Society. Have a plan like that, and then you can include other people's journal choices in the roadmap for the publication. I would say, I hope that helps. That's a fantastic question. Thank you for that.
It's a great question. And I've heard you use the term authorship prenup in the past, Gareth, and authorship prenuptial agreement. For those who don't know, that's before you get married and you and your partner agree on, assets and things before you marry. In the same way, I've heard you recommend that authors come to these agreements before they co-author papers together. I love that idea. It's fantastic. Great
No.
question, and thank you for your insights, Gareth. Do we have time for a couple of more questions, Gareth? What do you think?
100%, absolutely. 100. I see some questions have come in just now, so great.
Great. Yeah, a couple of questions coming into the chat box as well. Let's try this question from the chat box. It says, can a co-author be a person who is deceased but was involved in the research? What is your opinion?
Yes. I mean, the answer to that is yes. 100%. And this unfortunately
Posthumous credit.
happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does happen. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And you often see it marked depending on the journal and the way that they annotate the author order. But certainly, like somebody who's deceased can and should be listed as an author on a paper if they've contributed to the research. You just need to ask the journal editor how that needs to be annotated. So, in the same way that you mark your addresses with little numbers or little numerals in the final formatting of the article, maybe with an asterisk or some other kind of symbol, you would denote that, so and so unfortunately passed away, during the completion of this study, something like that. But the short answer to your question is yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Great question. Thank you. Let's go back to another question on journal selection. Our guest asks, how should one weigh the importance of journal responsiveness and publication timelines against the journal's prestige? So this is a great question. We talked about earlier how impact factors aren't the only thing. There are also other factors to consider. So our guest asks, in cases where speed and reputation are equally crucial, which factors should I prioritize? Okay, journal responsiveness versus prestige.
Yeah, really good. Well, it depends what career stage you're at and what your publication goals are. I mean, if you're an established professor, let's say, and you're not really all that desperate to publish like as quick as possible, then of course you can prioritize another factor. But if you're a PhD student or a master's student, and very often people need to get a Scopus Q1 or Q2 paper published to get their degree, then in those situations, I would 100% prioritize journal responsiveness over even potentially a higher impact factor, because if my university is saying you need to publish Scopus Q1 journal articles to get your PhD, and I've got a range of different options. I mean, of course, there's a whole like envelope of different impact factors that fall within that Scopus Q1 quartile, they call it. I mean, if you've got direct communication with a journal editor and they're being responsive, I would go with that one, because you're going to, get your work published quicker. The journal matches with your university's requirements, and you're going to get your degree quicker. Yeah, I hope that helps.
It's a great question. I think it does depend on what your priorities are in your position and your the state of your experience in your field. It's a great question, and thank you for your answer, Professor. We have some other questions about authorship, if we have time for one or two more. We had several guests asking about what if your research supervisor proofreads your article, provides suggestions for edits and word choices, assists with journal selection, but you've written the entire article yourself. If the supervisor then requests to be included as a co-author, is this acceptable? Does this constitute gift authorship if you co-credit your research supervisor, if they've provided those kinds of ancillary support services, but you've written the paper yourself? What are your thoughts, Professor?
It's a very, very tricky question, because of course you want to maintain like a good working relationship with your supervisor. Technically, the answer to this question is no. Just proofreading a paper, providing suggestions for improvement, providing help with journal selection is not enough to warrant co-authorship on a paper. If you have a look at the website of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, icmje.org, as well as the COPE website that Scott's already shared with you in the chat box, you'll find very, very clear guidelines on what you need to do, how you need to have contributed in order to be an author. And I see that Faiz, Dr. Ali Shah is saying this as well in the chat box. But having said that, it's very difficult if your supervisor is saying, I think I should be an author, for you in a junior position to say, well, I'm sorry, I don't think you've done enough. So very delicate balancing act you will encounter here. Everybody, unfortunately, encounters it. At the end of the day, it's on the supervisor. The ethics of the situation rests with the person who has more power and more prestige, I suppose. They should know, as a research professional, that simply editing something and suggesting a journal is not enough to be added as a co-author. And I see we've got several other questions about this as well. Like, yeah, I mean, generally speaking, do have a look at the websites that Scott shared, because, this is very important, and you should not be jumping on papers as an author if you haven't contributed significantly to the research, to the writing, and to the data collection. Thank you very much.
It's a fantastic question, and I think we're going to have to wrap up the questions here. If we couldn't get to your question today, we apologize, but feel free to reach out to us. I've put our email addresses in the chat. Feel free to reach out to Professor Dyke or myself, and we'd be happy to reply to you on behalf of Bentham Science and get you the information that you need. We'll also be sending you an email tomorrow around this time with your certificate and a full video recording with a transcript, as well as Professor Dyke's template for sending pre-submission inquiries, which is a great help. I've used it myself with clients. So it's great, and we'll send that to you tomorrow. Professor Dyke, thank you so much, as always, for sharing your insights with us. As I always say, I always learn loads from you doing these events together. Is there anything you would like to leave our audience with today before we go?
Just that this question about authorship is very difficult, and it's something that often comes up in our events. So do get in touch with us if you have any other questions, or we can provide any support. Don't forget to pass this QR code on to your librarian. If that's of interest, it will be in the recording that we're going to share in the next days as well. And of course, don't forget to follow Bentham Science on a variety of social media channels. Thank you so much, Scott, for your comradeship, friendship, and for hosting this event today. And thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you, Professor, and thanks to our guests. Have a great day, everyone.